The California sun hammered down on black asphalt as the transport vehicle rolled to a stop outside the Naval Special Warfare Center. Dust swirled in lazy circles, disturbed by tires that had traveled 2,000 miles to deliver one passenger. The door opened. Boot met pavement with purpose. Corporal Ashlyn Cade stepped into the heat, carrying two pieces of luggage. The first was a long black rifle case, matte finish worn smooth at the handle from years of use. The second was a military footlocker, olive drab and battered, with a nameplate that caught the sunlight: Master Sergeant W. Cade, 1st SFODD. Across the compound, three men stood in the shade of the armory entrance. Their conversation died as they registered the new arrival. The tallest one, broad-shouldered with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples, crossed his arms and said something to his companions that made them exchange glances. Staff Sergeant Garrett Wolf had been running SEAL sniper operations for 8 years. He had seen plenty of sailors come and go, watched talent rise and fall, learned to read capability in the way someone carried themselves. This was different. The brass had sent him William Cade's daughter like she was some kind of tribute, some living memorial to a legend 30 years dead. She can't weigh more than 130 soaking wet, Wolf thought, watching her shift the rifle case to her other hand with practiced ease. Petty Officer Reese Donnelly, younger and leaner, leaned closer to Wolf. "That's Cade's kid? The record holder?" "Same one," Wolf replied, his voice flat. "Let's see if talent's genetic or just stories people tell themselves." Lance Corporal Jax Hartley grinned and shook his head. "Command's really doing this, handing us a legacy case like it's some kind of recruitment poster." Ashlyn heard none of this, or rather, she heard all of it and filed it away in the part of her mind that had learned to catalog doubt and dismissal the way other people collected coins. She had heard it at basic training, heard it at sniper school, heard it at her last assignment. The words changed slightly each time, but the sentiment remained constant, predictable as sunrise over the Pacific. The base administration building stood ahead, its doors propped open to catch whatever breeze might stumble in from the ocean. Ashlyn adjusted her grip on the footlocker and pulled her orders from her cargo pocket. The paper was crisp against her calloused fingertips, official and final. Inside her chest, her heart beat steady and slow, the same rhythm she had trained it to maintain since childhood, since her father first put a rifle in her small hands and taught her that patience was the deadliest weapon of all. Commander Nathaniel Vance sat behind his desk reviewing personnel files when the knock came. "Enter," he called. The woman from the morning's arrival list stepped through the doorway. She moved like water, efficient and unhurried, the rifle case balanced perfectly against her leg. "Corporal Cade," Vance said, standing and extending his hand across the desk. "Welcome to the unit." "Thank you, sir." Her grip was firm, but not aggressive. Her eyes met his directly, no challenge in them, but no submission either. She stood at attention, waiting. Vance gestured to the chair across from him and sat back down. "I've reviewed your file. Expert marksmanship ratings across the board. 3 national championships in precision rifle, junior and open divisions. Your instructors at sniper school had exceptional things to say." Ashlyn nodded once. "I do my best, sir." Vance pulled a different folder from his drawer, this one older, edges worn from handling. "Your father held the base record for 30 years, 1,450 meters, 1994. It still stands." "I know, sir." Ashlyn's voice remained measured, but something flickered in her eyes. "I grew up hearing about it. He was killed in Afghanistan when you were 15. Vance watched her face carefully. "Is that why you're here?" Ashlyn took a breath, choosing her words with the same precision she applied to windage calculations. "Partly, sir, but I would have been a sniper regardless. He taught me it was a calling, not just a skill." Vance nodded slowly. "This team's been together 5 years. They're tight, close. They've developed their own rhythm, their own trust. Your father's legacy will make things complicated. I'm not asking for special treatment because of his name, sir." Ashlyn's voice carried quiet certainty. I'm asking to prove I deserve to carry it. Vance studied her for a long moment. He had served with William Cade briefly in the late 90s, had seen the man shoot, had witnessed firsthand the almost supernatural calm he brought to impossible situations. The daughter had the same stillness, the same sense of coiled capability held in check. You'll be bunking in Building 6, Vance said, sliding a folder across the desk. Training schedule, team roster, operational protocols. We run a tight unit here, Corporal. Everyone pulls their weight. Everyone maintains standards. No exceptions. Understood, sir. Vance leaned back in his chair. I won't pretend you won't face challenges. This is a close team. They'll test you the way they test everyone new. Show them what you can do, and you'll earn your place. Yes, sir. Something in her voice, some fundamental confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance, made Vance look at her more carefully. He had seen hundreds of operators come through his command. Most were competent, some were exceptional. A handful were legendary. Ashlyn Cade carried herself like someone who already knew which category she belonged in. Dismissed, Vance said. Report to the range at 0600 tomorrow. Staff Sergeant Wolf will be running qualifications. Ashlyn stood, gathered her folder and rifle case, and turned to leave. Corporal, Vance called after her, and she paused at the doorway. Good luck. She didn't smile, but her eyes acknowledged the sentiment before she stepped back into the California heat. The walk to Building 6 took her past the team common area where Wolf and his companions had moved to a bench in the shade. She felt their eyes tracking her, measuring, judging, making calculations that had nothing to do with ballistics and everything to do with assumptions. That's our new sniper, Wolf said, loud enough for her to hear. Going to be real interesting to see how this works out. Ashlyn kept walking, her stride even and unhurried. The rifle case balanced perfectly in her grip. The footlocker, though heavy, might as well have been empty for all the effort she showed carrying it. In her mind, she heard her father's voice from 20 years ago, patient and steady as always. Let them talk, sweetheart. Words are just air. What matters is what you do when the moment comes. What matters is the shot. Evening found Ashlyn alone in her quarters, the footlocker open on her bunk like a time capsule finally unsealed. Inside were the artifacts of her father's career, each item carefully preserved. Custom rifle parts he had machined himself, ballistics journals filled with calculations in his precise handwriting, competition medals from matches she had been too young to attend, photographs of teams and operations, faces she didn't recognize standing beside the one face she would never forget. At the bottom of the footlocker, wrapped in oiled canvas, was his training notebook. The leather cover was worn smooth from handling, the pages yellowed but intact. Ashlyn opened it carefully, reverently, and began reading entries she had never seen before. Her father's handwriting filled the margins with notes and observations, technical details mixed with philosophical reflections. She turned pages slowly, absorbing his thoughts on wind reading, on patience, on the mental discipline required to make shots that defied probability. The last entry was dated 1 week before his final deployment to Afghanistan. Her father's handwriting, usually so precise, showed slight trembling in the final lines. Personal reflections about her progress, pride in her achievements, hopes for her future. Words she had never been meant to read, written for himself alone in the quiet hours before deployment. The ink had smudged slightly on the last line, as if water had fallen on it before it dried. Ashlyn touched the page gently, tears tracking down her face in the privacy of her empty room. I'm trying, Dad, she whispered to the photograph tucked inside the journal's cover. I'm trying. Across the compound in the team common area, Wolf sat with Donnelly and Hartley, reviewing the next day's qualification schedule. The conversation had circled back to the new arrival. The way conversations in tight teams always circled back to changes in their composition. You really think Command sent her just because of her name? Donnelly asked, nursing a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Wolf set down his clipboard. I think Command wants to make a point. Female integration, legacy recruiting, optics, whatever you want to call it, she's here because of who her father was, not what she can do. Hartley leaned back in his chair. Cade was legendary, no question. But that was 30 years ago, different era. His daughter probably spent her whole life hearing stories, trying to live up to something that's more myth than reality at this point. We'll find out tomorrow, Wolf said. Range doesn't lie. Numbers don't lie. Either she can shoot or she can't. The door opened and Chief Petty Officer Brennan Cole stepped inside. Older than the others by a decade, weathered in the way that came from too many deployments and too many close calls, survived by inches. He had been quiet during the earlier discussion of the new arrival, noticeably absent from the speculation and judgment. "You all talking about Cade's daughter?" Brennan asked, though he already knew the answer. Wolf nodded. "You served with her father, didn't you?" 4 years, Brennan said, pouring himself coffee from the pot that had been sitting too long. Last 4 years before he transferred to Afghanistan. "What was he like?" Donnelly asked. "I mean, we've all heard the stories, the record, the reputation, but what was he actually like?" Brennan took a long drink of bitter coffee before answering. "William Cade was one of the most patient shooters I ever worked with. He could wait hours for the perfect shot, absolutely still, barely breathing. Most shooters get antsy, start second-guessing themselves. Not William. He trusted his preparation completely. He turned to face Wolf directly, and he never took credit, even for the shot that made him legendary. Always said it was teamwork, that I called the wind right, that the conditions happened to align. He could have built a career on that record. Instead, he just kept working, kept teaching, kept making everyone around him better." Wolf shifted uncomfortably under Brennan's steady gaze. "What's your point, Chief?" "My point is that you're already writing off his daughter before she's fired a single round here." Brennan's voice remained calm, but carried unmistakable weight. "Maybe she's here because of her name. Or maybe she's here because she's actually that good, and the name is just a coincidence." "We'll see tomorrow," Wolf repeated. "Yes," Brennan said. "We will." The morning air carried the salt smell of the Pacific as Ashlyn made her way to the range, boots crunching on gravel in the pre-dawn darkness. She had been awake since 4, had already run 5 miles along the perimeter fence, her breathing controlled and even throughout. Old habits died hard, and her father's voice still echoed in her mind from 1,000 training sessions. The body must be ready before the mind can focus, he had told her countless times. Physical preparation creates mental clarity. The range sprawled across the eastern section of the base, targets set at varying distances from 50 to 1,000 meters. Wolf was already there, clipboard in hand, talking with Gunnery Sergeant Iris Keller, a compact woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for seeing through pretense instantly. They both turned as Ashlyn approached. "Corporal Cade," Wolf said, his tone absolutely flat. "You're early." "Yes, Staff Sergeant," Ashlyn replied, setting her rifle case down on the shooting bench with care that bordered on reverence. Keller nodded at her, expression neutral but observant. "Morning, Corporal. Ready for qualifications?" "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant." Other team members began arriving as the sun broke the horizon, painting the range in shades of orange and gold. Donnelly showed up with Hartley, both of them laughing about something until they noticed Ashlyn. Their conversation dropped to murmurs, and Ashlyn caught the word nepotism before they moved to the opposite end of the firing line. "All right, listen up," Wolf called out once the team had assembled. "Standard qualifications today: 50 meters prone, 100 kneeling, 200 standing, 500 prone. 5 rounds each position. Corporal Cade goes first." Ashlyn heard the unspoken challenge in his voice, the way he emphasized her name like it was evidence of something. She moved to the firing line without comment, opened her case, and began assembling her rifle with practiced efficiency that spoke to thousands of hours of repetition. The weapon came together in her hands like pieces of a puzzle she had solved so many times The movements had become muscle memory, automatic and precise. "Nice rifle," Keller commented from behind her. "Custom build?" "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant," Ashlyn said, not looking up from her work. "Had it configured after sniper school based on my father's specifications." Wolf watched her movements, searching for hesitation or uncertainty, any sign that she was out of her depth. Instead, he saw hands that moved with absolute confidence, fingers that loaded the magazine with smooth precision, each round seated perfectly with the kind of assurance that came from endless practice. "Range is hot," Wolf announced. "Corporal Cade, you may commence firing when ready." Ashlyn dropped into prone position. Her body found the ground like water finding level, natural and effortless. She pressed her cheek to the stock, her breathing slowing to the rhythm her father had taught her 2 decades ago. The first target at 50 meters filled her scope, close enough that wind didn't matter, distance irrelevant. She fired 5 rounds in quick succession, the recoil absorbed into her shoulder, each shot a continuation of her breathing cycle. The targets at 50 meters showed tight groupings, all center mass, clustered in a space smaller than a fist. "Kneeling position," Wolf called. Ashlyn transitioned smoothly, her movements economical and controlled. 5 more rounds, 5 more impacts in the kill zone, the grouping so tight it looked almost accidental, like someone had fired once and the target had somehow replicated the whole. Hartley whispered something to Donnelly, and both men wore expressions that mixed surprise with something darker, something that looked like resentment. "Standing 200 meters, Wolf said, and there was a hint of anticipation in his voice now. "This is where many shooters struggled, fatigue setting in, the longer distance demanding more precision, the standing position offering no stability except what the shooter's body could provide." Ashlyn stood, adjusted her stance with micro movements, and took her time with each shot. The rhythm slowed. Each trigger press became its own meditation. The targets at 200 meters rang out with each impact, steel singing across the distance. Through the spotting scope, Keller watched the groupings remain impossibly tight. 12 years of running qualifications had shown her thousands of shooters attempting this exact sequence. What she was witnessing now was different. This wasn't competence. This was mastery. 500 meters, prone position, Wolf called, and something had changed in his tone, a slight edge that suggested he had expected different results by now. Ashlyn returned to the ground. Her body settled into position with a kind of stillness that seemed almost unnatural, like she had become part of the earth itself. She made a small adjustment to her scope, calculated for wind and distance, and fired. 5 rounds, 5 impacts, the sound of steel at 500 meters carrying back across the range with rhythmic precision. Wolf walked to check the targets himself, Keller following. When they returned, Wolf's face was carefully neutral, locked down in the way people's faces locked down when they had to deliver news they didn't want to believe themselves. "Adequate," he said. "You meet minimum standards." Keller said nothing, but her eyes lingered on Ashlyn for a moment longer than necessary. What she had just witnessed was far from merely adequate. It was controlled, efficient, and showed a level of comfort with a weapon that suggested extensive experience, the kind that started young and never stopped. The rest of the team took their turns. Wolf shot well, his groupings tight and consistent, the performance of someone who had dedicated years to the craft. Donnelly was competent, but rushed his shots slightly, eager instead of patient. Hartley showed promise, but lacked the discipline required for longer distances. His final grouping at 500 meters scattered across 8 inches. After qualifications ended, the team gathered near the armory to clean weapons. Ashlyn worked alone at the far bench, breaking down her rifle with meticulous care that bordered on ritual. Each component was examined, cleaned, and reassembled with the kind of attention that spoke to deep respect for the equipment, the understanding that a rifle was not just a tool, but a partner, something that required care and earned trust through proper maintenance. "So," Hartley said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "how exactly does someone become a SEAL sniper these days? Is it like a special legacy program now or something? Donnelly laughed and Wolf didn't stop them, his silence functioning as permission for the mockery to continue. Ashlyn continued her work, her hands steady as she ran a cleaning rod through the barrel with slow, deliberate strokes. Chief Petty Officer Brennan Cole, cleaning his own weapon at the adjacent bench, glanced over at her, then back at his work. 15 years in the teams had taught him to recognize when someone was being tested, and when the quiet ones often had the most to prove, and the deepest reserves to prove it with. As the morning wore into afternoon, Ashlyn completed her tasks and returned to her quarters. Inside her locker, tucked behind her uniforms, was the photograph in a simple frame. Her father in his Army Ranger uniform, young and proud, a rifle slung over his shoulder. She touched the glass gently, remembering his lessons about patience, about letting skills speak louder than words. Tomorrow will tell, she thought, time and opportunity. For now she would do her job, maintain her standards, and wait for the moment when her true capabilities would matter more than anyone's preconceptions or doubts. The week that followed settled into a rhythm that felt more like attrition than integration. Ashlyn arrived first to every training session, stayed last to complete her tasks, and spoke only when spoken to. The team's skepticism hadn't softened. If anything, it had hardened into something more deliberate, more pointed, like they were waiting for her to fail so they could confirm what they had already decided was true. Thursday morning brought physical training. The obstacle course stretched across 2 acres of unforgiving California terrain, walls to scale, rope climbs, tire runs, and a final sprint that left most sailors gasping. "All right," Wolf called out as the team assembled at the starting line. "Standard course run. Corporal Cade, you'll go first. Set the pace for everyone else." Hartley grinned at Donnelly. "This should be good," he muttered. Ashlyn stepped to the line, her expression unchanged. Wolf raised his hand and dropped it. "Go!" She exploded forward, her compact frame covering ground with efficient strides that wasted no energy on excess motion. The first wall came up fast, 8 feet of vertical wood, and she hit it at speed, her momentum carrying her up and over with a technique that spoke to countless repetitions. The rope climb was next, and her arms pulled her body upward with steady power, hand over hand, no wasted motion, no panic. Wolf watched through narrowed eyes as she navigated the course, each obstacle cleared with competence that was hard to dismiss. She wasn't the fastest, but she was smooth, controlled, never rushing or losing focus. When she crossed the finish line, her time was solidly in the acceptable range. Respectable, if not exceptional. "Not bad," Wolf said when she returned to the group, chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. "For someone your size." The comment hung in the air, barbed and deliberate. Ashlyn simply nodded, catching her breath with the same measured patience she brought to everything. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," she said evenly. The rest of the team ran the course. Hartley struggled on the rope climb, his technique sloppy, burning energy he couldn't afford to waste. Donnelly was fast but reckless, nearly losing his footing on the tire run, saving himself at the last second with a stumble that cost him precious seconds. Wolf ran last, his time the best of the group, and he made certain everyone knew it, announcing the numbers with barely concealed satisfaction. That afternoon brought range time again, but this session carried different weight. Gunnery Sergeant Keller had arranged for moving target drills, mechanical systems that slid along rails at varying speeds and distances, simulating the kind of shots that separated competent shooters from exceptional ones. "Standard protocol," Keller announced to the assembled team. 200 meters, lateral movement, 5 shots each. Best grouping wins bragging rights. The team took turns, and the results painted a clear picture of capability. Hartley managed 2 hits out of 5, his timing off, his lead inconsistent. Donnelly hit 3, better but still struggling with the mathematics of intersecting trajectories. Wolf landed 4 solid hits, his shots well-placed but not exceptional. The performance of someone who had mastered fundamentals but never pushed beyond them into true artistry. Brennan Cole, when his turn came, also hit 4 targets. His decades of experience showed in his steady performance, patient and professional, but even he couldn't claim perfection. "Corporal Cade," Keller called, "you're up." Ashlyn approached the line, loaded her magazine with the same careful precision she applied to everything, and settled into position. The target began its lateral slide, moving left to right at moderate pace. She tracked it with her scope, her breathing slowing to the rhythm that lived beneath conscious thought, and fired. The first shot found center mass, the second followed, then the third, fourth, and fifth, each one finding the mark with precision that made Keller lean forward slightly, professional interest overriding her usual detachment. Wolf checked the target through his spotting scope, his jaw tightening with each impact he confirmed. "5 for 5, he announced, his voice carefully neutral, stripped of inflection. "Good shooting, Corporal," Keller said, making a note on her clipboard. "Very good shooting." "She got lucky," Hartley said quietly to Donnelly, "but not quietly enough." Keller turned her sharp gaze on him. "Something to add, Lance Corporal?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that preceded storms. "No, Gunnery Sergeant," Hartley replied quickly, suddenly very interested in his boots. That evening in the team common area, the mockery took on a new edge, evolved from casual dismissal to something more barbed. Wolf sat with Hartley and Donnelly, their conversation loud enough to carry across the room where Ashlyn sat alone, reading a manual on advanced ballistics calculations. "I'm just saying," Hartley offered, "there's got to be some kind of explanation. Nobody shoots like that without special considerations somewhere along the line." "You mean like easier qualifications?" Donnelly suggested, his voice carrying mock innocence. "Legacy accommodations?" Wolf said nothing, but he didn't correct them either. His silence was permission, tacit approval for speculation that skirted the edge of disrespect. Chief Petty Officer Brennan Cole entered the common area, grabbed coffee from the pot that had been sitting too long, and noticed Ashlyn sitting alone. He had been in the teams long enough to recognize talent when he saw it, and also long enough to recognize when politics were interfering with merit. He considered saying something, then decided against it. She would have to prove herself on her own terms. That was how the teams worked, how they had always worked. Sink or swim, trial by fire, the strong survived and the weak washed out. Ashlyn turned a page in her manual, her expression unchanged, but inside she felt the familiar weight of isolation pressing down. It was nothing new, nothing she hadn't experienced before. Her father had warned her about this, had told her that being exceptional meant being alone, until the moment came to demonstrate why exceptional mattered, why it was worth the cost of separation. She thought about the moving target drill, how natural it had felt, how the calculations had happened almost automatically in her mind. Distance, speed, wind, the slight elevation difference, all of it processed in the fraction of a second before each shot. Mathematics become instinct through thousands of hours of practice that started when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle steady. "You don't shoot to impress, sweetheart," her father had told her when she was 12, frustrated with competition judges who seemed more interested in her age and gender than her scores. "You shoot because when it matters, when lives depend on it, there's no room for anything less than perfect." Ashlyn closed her manual and stood, walking past the group of men without acknowledging them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities to prove herself. She would meet them the same way she had met everything else, with patience, precision, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of, even if no one else did yet. In his office, Commander Vance sat alone with Ashlyn's personnel file open on his desk, reviewing details he had glossed over during her initial arrival. Expert marksmanship ratings across every category, instructor comments that were uniformly positive, bordering on glowing, competition records that would have been impressive for someone twice her age and 3 times her experience. He flipped to her background section, scanning details that told a story beyond simple statistics. Father, Army Ranger, Master Sergeant William Cade. Killed in action, Afghanistan, 2014. The notation was clinical, bureaucratic, but Vance had served with William Cade. He knew what those dry words meant. He knew what the military lost when that particular rifle went silent. Vance closed the file and looked out his window toward the darkened range where a single light marked someone still working, still training, still pushing. He suspected he knew who it was, knew the kind of dedication that drove someone to seek improvement even after a day of proving themselves repeatedly. He thought about intervening, about forcing Wolf to include her in next week's operation. But leadership sometimes meant letting teams work through their own dynamics, letting natural selection and demonstrated capability override prejudice and doubt. Or at least, that was what he told himself, the rationalization that let him sleep at night, while knowing he was allowing something unjust to continue. On the range, Ashlyn fired her final round of the evening, the target at 600 meters ringing out in the growing darkness. She stood, began breaking down her rifle with the same meticulous care she showed every piece of equipment, every tool that might someday mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Around her, the base had settled into its nighttime rhythm, lights in barracks windows, the distant sound of the ocean against rocks. The whole installation breathing with the life of people who had chosen something harder than civilian existence, something that demanded more and forgave less. Inside her mind, calculations continued. Distance, wind, elevation. All the variables that turn shooting from simple skill into complex art form, from mechanical act into something approaching meditation. Her father had taught her that the rifle was just a tool, that the real weapon was the mind behind it. Patience, he had said, precision, and the absolute certainty that when the moment comes, you will be ready. She packed her equipment, secured her rifle case, and walked back toward her quarters under a sky full of stars. Alone, but not lonely. Excluded, but not defeated. Tomorrow would bring the operation briefing, the moment when Wolf would finalize his team selections, when she would learn whether capability mattered more than comfort, whether excellence could overcome prejudice. Whatever the answer, she would be ready, because that was what her father had taught her. That was what William Cade's daughter did. She prepared, she waited, and when the moment came, she made the shot that mattered. The walk back to Building 6 took her past the memorial wall, where photographs of fallen operators lined the corridor in silent testimony. Her father's photograph was there, young and proud in dress uniform, the Medal of Honor citation beneath it, describing actions in Afghanistan that saved 11 lives at the cost of his own. She stopped as she always did and touched the frame gently. "I'm here, Dad," she whispered, "and I'm ready, just like you taught me." Tomorrow would tell whether ready was enough. 3 weeks passed in a blur of routine and careful isolation. Ashlyn maintained her training regimen while the team prepared for their operation, their excitement building with each passing day, like pressure in a sealed container. She ran her miles every morning in the pre-dawn darkness. She cleaned her weapons until they gleamed. She studied advanced ballistics texts that most shooters never bothered to read, technical manuals that turned physics into practical application. Then came the morning that changed everything. Commander Vance called an emergency all-hands meeting, his expression grave as the team assembled in the briefing room. Even Ashlyn was summoned, standing at the back while Wolf and his selected operators filled the front rows, their body language suggesting they had already claimed ownership of whatever mission was coming. "Change of plans," Vance announced without preamble, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of bodies settling into seats. "Division has modified the exercise parameters. They want to test our capabilities under more challenging conditions." Wolf straightened in his chair, suddenly alert. "Sir, we've already finalized the team composition. We're ready to execute as planned." "I'm aware," Vance said, and something in his tone suggested this conversation had already happened in private. that what the team was witnessing now was the public performance of a decision already made. But this new element requires specialized skills. We need someone who can make shots at extreme distances in less than ideal conditions. He pulled up a new slide showing terrain maps and elevation charts, satellite imagery of the range complex marked with overlays indicating wind patterns and sightlines. Targets at 800 to 1200 meters, Vance continued. Variable wind conditions, moving observations, time constraints. Division wants to see if we can perform surgical strikes at extended range while coordinating with assault elements. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. Brennan Cole glanced at Wolf, then back at Vance, reading the tension in the commander's shoulders. "What kind of distances are we talking about, sir?" Brennan asked, though his experience already told him the answer. 800 to 1200 meters, Vance repeated, in weather conditions that our meteorological team is predicting will be challenging at best, potentially prohibitive at worst. Wolf's jaw tightened. "My shooters can handle it, sir. We've trained for extended range operations." "Can they?" Vance asked, and there was an edge to his voice now that made everyone pay attention, the kind of sharpness that preceded career-defining moments. "Because the scoring metrics on this have changed. This isn't just about completing the exercise. This is about demonstrating capabilities that could determine future mission assignments and funding." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a physical presence. Future missions meant real operations, and real operations meant the difference between a unit that deployed and one that trained endlessly without purpose, slowly dying from lack of application. "Captain Hale sent me updated performance analytics," Vance continued, pulling up another slide. The screen filled with data, qualification scores from the past month, moving target accuracy percentages, environmental adaptation metrics. Every category showed names ranked by performance, and in every single category, one name sat at the top with numbers that were not just better than the rest, but significantly, undeniably superior. Ashlyn Cade. Wolf stared at the screen, his face reddening as the reality of objective measurement confronted subjective preference. Hartley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Donnelly looked down at his boots, suddenly finding the floor fascinating. "Corporal Cade," Vance said, and Ashlyn straightened at the back of the room. "You're now primary sniper for the exercise. Wolf, adjust your team composition accordingly." "Sir," Wolf began, but Vance cut him off with a raised hand that brooked no argument. "This isn't a discussion, Staff Sergeant. We have 3 days to prepare, and I need our best people in the right positions. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Wolf said through clenched teeth, the words forced out like something bitter he had no choice but to swallow. The meeting adjourned, and the team filed out in uncomfortable silence, the kind that followed revelations no one wanted, but everyone had to acknowledge. Ashlyn remained behind as Vance gathered his materials, waiting while the room emptied. "Corporal," Vance said without looking up from his papers, "you'll meet with Gunnery Sergeant Keller tomorrow morning at 0600. She'll brief you on the specific requirements and expectations." "Yes, sir." Vance finally looked at her, and something in his expression suggested he was seeing not just the young woman in front of him, but the ghost of her father standing beside her. "This is your opportunity. Don't waste it." "I won't, sir," Ashlyn said, and there was something in her voice, a quiet certainty that made Vance believe her. Absolutely. That afternoon, Ashlyn found herself in the armory, conducting a detailed equipment check when footsteps approached from behind. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the presence, just continued her methodical inspection of each component. "Big exercise now," Petty Officer Reese Donnelly said, leaning against the doorframe with studied casualness. "Yes," Ashlyn replied, not looking up from her work. Donnelly watched her for a moment, observing the way her hands moved over the equipment with practiced familiarity, checking tolerances and clearances with the kind of attention most people reserved for precious artifacts. "Wolf's not happy about it," Donnelly observed. "I gathered that." "Look," Donnelly said, pushing off from the doorframe and taking a few steps closer. "I've been doing this for a while, 5 years with this team. I've seen a lot of shooters come through, a lot of people try to prove themselves." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're different. You don't shoot like someone who's trying to prove something. You shoot like someone who already knows." Ashlyn paused in her work, finally looking us at him. "My father was a sniper, Army Rangers. He taught me before I could ride a bike." Donnelly nodded slowly. "What happened to him?" "KIA, Afghanistan," Ashlyn said, the words coming out flat in practice from years of saying them. "2014. I was 15. Donnelly's expression softened. "I'm sorry, that's rough." Ashlyn returned to her equipment check, the conversation apparently over as far as she was concerned. But Donnelly lingered. "For what it's worth," he said, "I looked up your competition scores. 3 national championships, 2 in open division against shooters with 20 years more experience. That's not daddy's reputation, that's skill." "Thank you," Ashlyn said quietly. After Donnelly left, Ashlyn finished her equipment inspection and sat alone in the armory, her father's words echoing in her memory. He had told her once, during a particularly frustrating competition where judges seemed more interested in her age than her accuracy, that recognition would come when it mattered, not when she wanted it. "Patience, sweetheart," he had said. "Let the rifle speak for you. Numbers don't lie and targets don't have opinions." That evening, Wolf gathered what remained of his original team in the common area. Everyone except Ashlyn. His frustration was evident in every line of his body, in the way he paced while the others sat and watched. "This is politics," he said, the words coming out sharp and angry. "Plain and simple, Vance is trying to make a statement." Brennan Cole, sitting in the corner with coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, said nothing. He had reviewed the same analytics Vance had shown, had seen the numbers that couldn't be argued with. Ashlyn's performance was objectively superior across every measurable category. "We trained together," Wolf continued, his pacing becoming more agitated. "We operate together. We've built cohesion over 5 years. Throwing someone in at the last minute disrupts everything we've developed." "She's been here for a month," Brennan finally said, his voice calm and measured in contrast to Wolf's agitation. "And her numbers are solid. Better than solid. If she can make those shots, we need her making them." Wolf turned to him, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "You're defending this?" "I'm reading the data," Brennan replied evenly, meeting Wolf's gaze without flinching. "If she can make those shots, it doesn't matter how long she's been here. What matters is capability." Wolf's response died on his lips as Commander Vance appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately commanding attention. The room fell silent. "Gentlemen," Vance said, his voice carrying quiet authority, "I expect professional conduct during this exercise. Whatever personal feelings exist, they stay here. On the field, we're one unit. Am I clear?" "Yes, sir," came the chorus of responses, automatic and immediate. Vance left and the room remained silent for a long moment. Wolf stared at the door, his jaw working as he processed emotions he couldn't quite name. Resentment, certainly. Frustration. But underneath it all, something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like fear. 5 years ago, he had trusted a spotter who made a critical mistake. 5 years ago, he had taken a shot based on faulty information and watched his teammate take a round to the chest because of it. The young man had survived, barely, but the screams still echoed in Wolf's dreams. The sound of someone dying even though their body refused to stop breathing. He had sworn then that he would never again put his faith in someone unproven, someone he didn't know absolutely and completely. And now Vance was forcing his hand, making him trust someone he had known for less than a month. Someone whose only credential was a famous name and impressive scores on a peaceful range. In her quarters, Ashlyn ran calculations in a notebook, mapping wind patterns and elevation changes for the terrain they would be operating in. She didn't need 3 days to prepare. She had been preparing her entire life. Every training session with her father, every competition, every hour spent studying ballistics in atmospheric conditions. But 3 days would give her time to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no room for doubt, no space for dismissal. Just the impossible shot that would silence every question. The morning of the exercise arrived with heavy clouds rolling in from the Pacific, the kind of weather that made long-range shooting exponentially more difficult. Ashlyn stood on the ridge overlooking the exercise area, watching the wind push the clouds across the sky in irregular patterns that defied simple prediction. Perfect conditions for failure, she thought, or perfect conditions to prove something that couldn't be ignored. A tactical vehicle climbed the access road, kicking up dust that the wind immediately scattered. Gunnery Sergeant Keller stepped out, her expression all business as she surveyed the terrain with professional assessment. "Corporal," she said, walking up beside Ashlyn, "weather's not cooperating." "No, Gunnery Sergeant," Ashlyn replied, watching a particularly strong gust bend the scrub grass nearly horizontal. Keller pulled out a rangefinder and began taking measurements, her movements efficient and practiced. "Your primary position is here on this ridge. Secondary fallback is 200 meters east. Targets will be marked by smoke at ranges between 800 and 1,200 meters. You'll have observers calling wind and movement, but ultimately the shots are yours." "Understood," Ashlyn said, already calculating sight lines and potential obstacles, mapping trajectories in her mind. Keller turned to face her directly, and something in her expression suggested this was more than just standard briefing. "I'm going to be honest with you, Corporal. Division is watching this closely. Commander Vance stuck his neck out getting you this position. Wolf has filed informal complaints. There are people who want to see you fail." Ashlyn met her eyes steadily. "What do you want to see, Gunnery Sergeant?" Keller allowed herself a small smile. "I want to see if you're as good as your scores suggest. Because if you are, you'll change some minds today. And if you're not, it's going to make things harder for everyone who comes after you." The weight of that responsibility settled on Ashlyn's shoulders, but it wasn't unfamiliar. She had carried it since her father died, since she decided to follow in his footsteps, despite everyone telling her it was impossible, that women didn't belong in combat roles, that she was chasing a ghost instead of building her own legacy. The team assembled at the Operations Center, a temporary structure erected for exercise, command, and control. Wolf ran through the tactical plan, his voice clipped and professional, every word carefully chosen to convey information without emotion. Assault elements would move on targets at designated times, coordinated with Ashlyn's fire support. Brennan Cole would be her spotter, feeding her information on wind and target movement. Donnelly and Hartley were assigned to the assault team, their faces showing barely concealed satisfaction at being in direct action roles, while Ashlyn sat alone on a ridge. Wolf gave them their briefing with detail and care, running through contingencies and communication protocols. Then he turned to Ashlyn, almost as an afterthought, his tone shifting to something dismissive. "Corporal Cade, you'll receive target coordinates via radio. Take your shots when you have them. Try not to miss." The casual dismissal in his tone was clear, deliberate, designed to undermine. But Ashlyn simply nodded, her expression unchanged. "Yes, Staff Sergeant." Brennan gathered his spotting equipment and fell in beside Ashlyn as they moved to their position. The climb to the ridge was steep, rocky terrain that demanded attention, and they moved in silence, conserving energy for what would come later. When they reached the top, Brennan began setting up his scope, while Ashlyn prepared her rifle, each of them working with the kind of focused efficiency that came from years of practice. "You ready for this?" Brennan asked, his tone neutral, simply gathering information. "Yes, Chief," Ashlyn replied, checking her equipment with methodical precision. Brennan studied her for a moment, taking in her calm demeanor, the absence of nervous energy that plagued most shooters before high-stakes operations. "Wolf wants you to fail," he said bluntly. "So does half the team." Ashlyn adjusted her scope, her movements calm and practiced. "I know. Does that bother you?" Brennan asked. Ashlyn settled into her shooting position, getting comfortable behind her rifle, feeling the ground beneath her, reading the wind that swept across the ridge. "My father told me something once. He said the target doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care if people believe in you or doubt you. It just sits there, waiting. All that matters is whether you can hit it." Brennan nodded slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Smart man, your father." "He was," Ashlyn said quietly, and something in her voice carried the weight of loss that time hadn't diminished. The radio crackled to life, Commander Vance's voice cutting through the white noise of wind and distance. "All elements, this is command. Exercise begins in 5 minutes. Sniper team, confirm position." Brennan keyed his radio. "Sniper team set, primary position, standing by." Ashlyn scanned the terrain through her scope, identifying the marked target areas before the smoke even appeared. 800 meters to the first position, 950 to the second, 1100 to the third. The wind was gusting irregularly, pushing clouds across the valley, creating swirling patterns that would make consistent shooting nearly impossible for most marksmen. "Exercise hot," Wolf's voice came through the radio, carrying undertones of tension. "Assault team moving to objective Alpha." Ashlyn watched through her scope as the assault element advanced across the valley below. They moved with practiced efficiency, covering ground quickly, their formations tight and professional. Then the first target indicator appeared, orange smoke marking a position at 800 meters. "Sniper team, you have target Alpha," Wolf said. "Engage when ready." Brennan pressed his eye to a spotting scope, reading the conditions with decades of experience informing his assessment. Wind left to right, gusting at 12 knots. "Target stationary. Your call." Ashlyn's breathing slowed, her body settling into absolute stillness. She calculated wind drift, elevation difference, air density in the heavy weather. The mathematics happened automatically now, decades of training reducing complex physics to instinct that operated faster than conscious thought. She squeezed the trigger with pressure so gentle it surprised even her. The rifle barked, and through the scope she watched the round impact center mass on the target, 6 inches from the smoke marker. "Hit," Brennan called, his voice carrying professional satisfaction. "Center mass confirmed." "Confirmed," Wolf said, and there was surprise in his voice despite his attempt to hide it beneath professional detachment. The assault team continued moving, and more targets appeared. 900 meters, then 950, each one requiring adjustment for the changing wind, different elevations, the shifting light as clouds moved overhead. Ashlyn fired, adjusted, fired again. Each shot found its mark with precision that made the impossible look routine. In the operations center, Commander Vance stood beside Captain Victoria Hale, watching the exercise unfold on monitors fed by overhead drones. Every shot Ashlyn took was being recorded, every hit or miss documented for the division observers, who would determine the unit's readiness rating. "She's good," Hale said quietly, her voice carrying professional admiration. "She's better than good," Vance replied, watching another target marker disappear as Ashlyn's round found home. Hale turned to look at him, something curious in her expression. "You knew her father." It wasn't a question. Vance nodded, memories rising unbidden. "Served with him in the 90s. William Cade had the kind of patience most people can't comprehend. He could wait hours for the perfect shot without moving a muscle. That discipline is rare." "She has it," Hale observed, watching Ashlyn on the monitor, noting the way she held position between shots. Conserved energy, moved with economy that suggested deep understanding of her own body's capabilities and limitations. On the ridge, Ashlyn maintained her rhythm. Breathe, calculate, fire, observe. Each shot was a conversation between her and the target, everything else falling away. The wind shifted, and she adjusted. The light changed as clouds moved, and she compensated. This was what her father had trained her for, what every hour on the range had prepared her to do. Then Wolf's voice cut through the radio with an edge of tension that made everyone pay attention. Sniper team, new target at 1150 meters, priority engagement. This is your long shot, Corporal. Ashlyn shifted her scope to the new position, and her heart rate stayed steady even as she registered the difficulty. 1150 meters in gusting wind with changing light conditions. The kind of shot that tested the limits of equipment and shooter alike. The kind of shot that would either silence doubt or confirm it. The target at 1150 meters sat in a valley depression, partially obscured by the shifting weather. Ashlyn studied it through her scope, watching the wind indicators, the way grass bent and recovered, the movement of dust and debris that told stories about air currents invisible to the naked eye. Brennan pressed his eye to the spotting scope, running calculations on his data pad with fingers that had performed this dance thousands of times. Winds all over the place, gusting between 10 and 15 knots, direction changing every 30 seconds. You've got maybe a 20-second window when it stabilizes. Ashlyn adjusted her position slightly, feeling the ground beneath her, the way the ridge channeled wind in unpredictable patterns. She had made shots like this before, in competitions her father had entered her in when she was barely old enough to carry the rifle. But never with this much riding on it. Never with an entire team's respect hanging in the balance. Strip team, what's your status? Wolf's voice carried impatience that bordered on hope, the kind of anticipation that suggested he expected failure and was already preparing his justifications. Assessing conditions, Brennan replied calmly. Stand by. In the operations center, Vance watched the overhead feed showing Ashlyn's position on the ridge. The division observers stood behind him, their expressions neutral, but their clipboards active, documenting every moment. This shot would define the exercise, would determine whether their unit received high readiness marks or was relegated to extended training status. She's taking her time, one of the observers commented, and there was criticism implied in the observation. It's a difficult shot, Hale replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been making life-and-death decisions for decades. Rushing it guarantees failure. On the ridge, Ashlyn closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out everything except the feel of the wind on her face, the sound it made moving through the valley below. Her father had taught her this, to trust her body's ability to read conditions that instruments could only approximate. The wind is alive, sweetheart, he had said during a particularly challenging competition when she was 14 and frustrated by conditions that seemed impossible to predict. Learn to listen to it, feel it, become part of it instead of fighting against it. She opened her eyes and settled deeper into her position. The wind gusted hard, then died slightly, then gusted again. But there, in the pattern, she found a rhythm. 3 seconds of strong wind from the left, 2 seconds of relative calm, then the cycle repeated. She watched through her scope, confirming the pattern twice, 3 times, making certain her read was accurate. Winds settling into a pattern, she said to Brennan. I'm taking the shot on the next calm cycle. Brennan checked his instruments, his data showing high variance that contradicted her assessment. You sure? The readings are still showing irregular gusts. I'm sure, Ashlyn said, her voice carrying absolute certainty that came from somewhere deeper than instruments or mathematics. Wolf's voice crackled through the radio again, impatience giving way to something sharper. Sniper team, we need that target engaged. Assault element is exposed, waiting for your fire support. Copy that, Brennan replied. Shooter is ready. Ashlyn waited, watching the grass bend, watching the dust swirl. The wind gusted hard, and she let it pass, patient as stone. Then the calm came, that brief moment when nature held its breath. She squeezed the trigger with the same gentle pressure she had learned 20 years ago, the same motion that had become as natural as breathing. The rifle's report echoed across the valley, and time seemed to slow as the round traveled downrange. 1,150 meters was a long conversation between bullet in distance, long enough for doubt to creep in, for second-guessing to take root. But Ashlyn felt none of that. She knew with the certainty that came from perfect execution that the shot was true. "Hit," Brennan called, his voice rising slightly with surprise he couldn't quite suppress. "Direct center mass." There was a beat of silence on the radio, too long, pregnant with implications. "Confirmed," Wolf finally said. "Good shot, Corporal." In the operations center, one of the division observers let out a low whistle. That was exceptional. Environmental conditions alone made that a 5% probability shot. Vance allowed himself a small smile. Corporal Cade is full of surprises. The exercise continued and Ashlyn engaged 6 more targets over the next 2 hours, each shot successful despite deteriorating weather conditions. The clouds had dropped lower, visibility decreasing, wind becoming more erratic, conditions that would have forced most shooters to call off operations entirely. The final phase of the exercise involved moving targets, mechanical systems designed to simulate enemy personnel repositioning under fire. The targets moved at variable speeds, appearing and disappearing behind terrain features. Standard protocol called for a 30% hit rate on moving targets at extreme range. Anything above 50% was considered exceptional. "Sniper team," Wolf called, and something had changed in his voice, a subtle shift that suggested recalculation of assumptions. "Multiple mobile targets entering engagement zone. Engage at discretion." Ashlyn tracked the first target through her scope, calculating speed and trajectory in the fractional seconds she had available. The mathematics were more complex now, requiring her to predict not just where the target was, but where it would be when the bullet arrived after more than 2 seconds of flight time. She led the target, accounting for its speed in the wind drift, and fired. "Hit," Brennan called. She shifted to the second target, faster moving, more erratic in its pattern. She watched it for 3 seconds, found the rhythm in its movement, the predictability that existed even in apparent chaos, and fired again. Hit. Over the next 15 minutes, she engaged 12 moving targets. 11 found their mark. The single miss came when the wind gusted unexpectedly just as she fired, pushing the round 6 inches wide. Still close enough to be recorded as a near miss, but Ashlyn felt it like a personal failure, a crack in the perfection she had been building. "Outstanding performance," Hale's voice came through the radio, carrying genuine admiration that years of military professionalism couldn't quite suppress. Exercise complete. All teams returned to base. The assault element cheered, their voices carrying across the radio frequency, relief and celebration mixing. Wolf was silent, and Ashlyn imagined she could hear the gears turning in his mind, recalculating assumptions he had held for weeks, adjusting parameters he had thought were fixed. Brennan began packing up his spotting equipment, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. That was something special, he said, not looking at Ashlyn but speaking to the valley, to the targets, to the memory of a shooter who would have been proud. "I've been doing this for 15 years, worked with shooters from every branch. What you just did in these conditions, that's world-class." Ashlyn disassembled her rifle with the same careful attention she always showed, treating each component with the respect it deserved. "Thank you, Chief." They made their way down from the ridge as the rain finally began to fall, light at first, then heavier, sheets of gray water that obscured the valley and turned the world soft and indistinct. By the time they reached the operations center, the exercise area had disappeared behind curtains of precipitation. Captain Hale met them at the entrance, a rare smile on her face that suggested she had just witnessed something worth celebrating. "Division observers want to see you," she said to Ashlyn. "Commander Vance, too. This is going to be interesting." Ashlyn followed Hale inside, water dripping from her gear, her rifle case slung over her shoulder. In the main room, the assault team had gathered, and they fell silent as she entered, their easy celebration dying into uncomfortable quiet. Wolf stood near the back, his expression unreadable, Years of command discipline locking down whatever emotions churned beneath the surface. Hartley and Donnelly looked at their boots, sudden fascination with standard-issue footwear. Only Brennan met her eyes, and he nodded with genuine respect that needed no words. Commander Vance stood at the front of the operations center with the two division observers flanking him, their uniforms crisp despite the weather outside, authority worn like comfortable clothing. The room had cleared of unnecessary personnel, leaving only the core team, Wolf included, all waiting to hear the assessment that would determine their unit's future operational status. "Gentlemen," Vance began, then corrected himself with a glance at Ashlyn. "And Corporal Cade, the division observers have completed their evaluation." Captain Hale stepped forward, her silver hair pulled back severely, her eyes carrying the weight of 3 decades in special operations. "I'll be direct. This unit's performance today exceeded expectations in every measurable category. Coordination was excellent. Assault elements executed flawlessly. Support operations were textbook." She paused, letting the compliment settle before continuing. "However, what elevated this from a passing grade to an exceptional rating was the sniper performance." She turned to face Ashlyn directly. "Corporal Cade, your hit rate today was 92% across all targets, including moving and extreme range engagements, in weather conditions that should have reduced effectiveness by at least 40%. The room was silent. Wolf's jaw worked as he processed the numbers, as objective measurement confronted subjective resistance. Brennan nodded slowly, having witnessed every shot himself, knowing the truth of what had been accomplished. Donnelly allowed himself a slight smile. "The 1150 shot," Hale continued, "has been reviewed by our technical team. Given wind variance, elevation differential, and target profile, our computers calculated a 7% probability of success. You made it look routine." Ashlyn stood at attention, her face carefully neutral despite the praise washing over her. "Thank you, ma'am." Hale turned back to Vance. "Commander, your unit receives high readiness status. You're cleared for deployment consideration on future operations." She glanced at her notes one final time. "I'm also recommending that Corporal Cade be evaluated for advanced marksmanship instructor certification. Skills of this caliber should be shared with the broader community." Vance nodded, allowing himself a broader smile, now that the political pressure had lifted. "Excellent news, Captain. Thank you." As the observers departed, the tension in the room shifted, transformed from the weight of judgment to something more complex, more personal. Wolf stood near the wall, his arms crossed, his expression showing internal conflict that years of command had taught him to hide from most observers, but that Ashlyn could read clearly. The data was undeniable. The performance recorded and verified and witnessed by people who mattered. Everything he had assumed about her had been proven wrong in the most public way possible, with numbers that couldn't be argued away or dismissed as luck or accommodation. "Corporal Cade," Vance said, and the formality of her rank felt suddenly strange in the room that had just witnessed something beyond standard military performance. "You're dismissed. Excellent work today." Ashlyn saluted and left the operations center, stepping back into rain that had intensified, drops drumming on metal roofing with rhythmic insistence. Behind her, she heard Vance begin speaking to the team, his voice fading as she walked across the compound toward her quarters, rifle case protected under her jacket, rain soaking through her uniform. Halfway there, footsteps splashed behind her. She turned to find Donnelly jogging to catch up, rain running down his face. "Hey," he called. "Hold up." Ashlyn stopped, waiting as he reached her, both of them standing in weather that would have sent most people seeking shelter. "That was incredible," Donnelly said, rain running down his face, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "I mean, I knew you were good from watching you train, but today, that was different. That was something else entirely." "Just doing my job," Ashlyn replied, the same line she had given Brennan, the deflection that had become automatic. Donnelly shook his head. "No, it was more than that. That 11:50 shot, Brennan said you called the wind pattern when his instruments were showing chaos. How did you know? Ashlyn considered the question, remembering her father's lessons in the hills behind their house, learning to read nature's rhythms before she could read books, before she understood that what came naturally to her was exceptional to others. Experience, she said finally. Lots of practice. My father started teaching me wind reading when I was 6 years old. By the time I was 12, I could predict patterns that instruments missed. Your father, Donnelly said, understanding dawning. He taught you all this. Ashlyn nodded. From the time I was 6 until he deployed for the last time. Every weekend, every summer, every spare moment. He said if I was going to do this, I needed to be better than good. I needed to be undeniable. Well, Donnelly said, you're definitely that now. They stood in the rain for a moment longer before Donnelly spoke again, his voice dropping to something more private. Wolf's struggling with this. Seeing you succeed, I mean. It's not about you being a woman or Cade's daughter anymore. It's about his whole worldview getting challenged. Give him time. Ashlyn looked toward the operations center where lights still burned. I don't need his approval. I just need to do my job. Fair enough, Donnelly said, but for what it's worth, you changed some minds today, mine included. I thought I knew what elite shooting looked like. You showed me I didn't. After Donnelly left, Ashlyn continued to her quarters, stripped off her wet uniform, and sat on her bunk in the quiet that followed accomplishment. The adrenaline from the exercise was fading, leaving behind the familiar, hollow feeling that followed vindication, the strange emptiness that came from finally proving what you had always known was true. She had demonstrated capabilities that couldn't be dismissed, silenced the doubters with performance that exceeded objective standards. But she knew from experience that one exceptional day, however well documented, wouldn't erase weeks of skepticism and dismissal overnight. Trust built slowly in teams like this, and she had just taken the first real step. The question was whether Wolf and the others would let that step lead somewhere, or whether they would find new reasons to maintain their distance, new justifications for keeping her at arm's length. Tomorrow would bring the traditional post-exercise debrief, the session where teams analyze their performance with the honesty that came from mutual respect. Ashlyn had almost decided not to attend, to avoid the awkwardness of sitting with people who still weren't certain they wanted her there. But Brennan had specifically asked her to come, and something in his voice suggested that tomorrow might be different, that the numbers from today's exercise had created space for something new to grow. She pulled out her father's journal and opened it to one of his technical entries, reading words about wind patterns and patience, words that felt like conversation, like his voice speaking across the years that separated them. Tomorrow, she thought, she would start casting her own shadow in earnest. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of transforming individual excellence into collective elevation, of proving that her value extended beyond personal capability into something that could lift an entire team. Tomorrow. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, a brief acknowledgement that she had done what seemed impossible. She had made the shots that mattered, under conditions that should have prevented success, watched by people who wanted to see her fail. And she had made it look easy. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the range clean, erasing the evidence of the day's work. But the numbers remained, recorded and verified, and impossible to deny. 92%, 1,150 meters, conditions calculated at 7% probability. The numbers told a story that words couldn't change, and tomorrow, that story would continue. The morning after the exercise brought a clarity to the California air that seemed almost symbolic. The storm had passed, leaving behind skies so blue they hurt to look at, and a coolness that made breathing feel like drinking fresh water. Ashlyn woke at her usual time, ran her usual miles, maintained her usual routine because disruption was the enemy of excellence, and excellence was the only currency that mattered here. The team common area filled slowly as sailors drifted in for the traditional post-exercise debrief. These sessions were usually relaxed affairs, operators sharing stories and critiquing their own performance with the honesty that came from mutual respect and shared experience. Ashlyn hesitated outside the door, listening to the voices within, trying to gauge whether her presence would be welcomed or merely tolerated. Brennan Cole appeared beside her, materializing from wherever chiefs materialize from when they were needed. "You planning to stand out here all morning?" he asked, his voice carrying dry amusement. "Considering it," Ashlyn admitted. "Don't," Brennan said. "They need to see you as part of the team, not someone who hides from uncomfortable conversations." He pulled the door open and gestured for her to enter first. The conversation didn't stop entirely when she walked in, but it shifted, voices dropping to lower registers as eyes tracked her movement across the room. Hartley glanced at her and nodded, the gesture small but genuine. Donnelly actually made space at one of the tables, sliding his chair over to create room. Wolf sat in his usual corner, nursing coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago, reviewing notes with the focused attention of someone avoiding eye contact. But when Brennan called the room to attention, Wolf stood with the others, his military bearing reasserting itself over personal discomfort. "All right," Brennan said, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of competence. "Let's talk about yesterday. What worked, what didn't, what we need to improve." The debrief proceeded normally at first, each element discussing their performance with the brutal honesty that separated professional units from merely adequate ones. The assault team had executed well with only minor timing issues on the approach to Objective Bravo. Communications had been solid throughout, no missed calls or garbled transmissions. Support coordination had been seamless, everyone where they needed to be when they needed to be there. Then Brennan turned to Ashlyn, and the room's attention focused like a lens catching sunlight. "Corporal Cade," he said, his tone suggesting this was routine, but his eyes conveying something more. "Talk us through your process. How did you maintain that hit rate in those conditions?" Ashlyn stood, feeling every eye in the room on her like physical weight. She had never been comfortable with public speaking, had always preferred to let her rifle do the talking. But technical discussion was different. That was just sharing information, passing on knowledge that might help someone else make a critical shot when it mattered. "I mapped wind patterns before engaging each target," she said, her voice steady despite the scrutiny. "Found the rhythm in what looked like chaos. Each shot required individual calculation based on real-time conditions, not preset data or average readings." "The 1150 shot?" Hartley asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice now, the mockery from previous weeks absent. "Brennan said you called the wind when his instruments showed it was impossible. How?" Ashlyn nodded, remembering the moment, the feeling of wind on her face, the certainty that came from trusting senses her father had spent years training. "Instruments measure averages. They tell you what conditions were a second ago, or what they are at your position. But wind moves in patterns, creates rhythms. If you can find the pattern, you can find the window." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "My father taught me to trust what I felt as much as what I measured. He said instruments are tools, but the shooter's body is the primary sensor. You have to learn to read the world directly." "Your father was a ranger," Brennan said, and there was respect in his voice that made Ashlyn's chest tighten. "He trained you for this." "Since I was 6, Ashlyn confirmed. "Every weekend on the range, every summer studying ballistics. By the time I was 12, I was competing in national championships. He believed that excellence required dedication that started early and never stopped." Wolf looked up from his notes, something shifting in his expression. "National championships? How many?" "3 gold medals," Ashlyn said quietly. "Junior division precision rifle. Then 2 more in the open division before I enlisted, competing against shooters with 20, 30 years of experience." The room absorbed this information with visible recalibration. Hartley exchanged glances with Donnelly, pieces clicking into place. Brennan nodded slowly, things he had suspected now confirmed. Wolf set down his coffee and stood, walking to the front of the room where Ashlyn stood, every eye tracking his movement. The confrontation that had been building since her arrival finally arrived, unavoidable as sunrise. Wolf stood before her and the entire team watched, waiting to see which way this moment would break, whether toward integration or permanent division. Wolf's face showed the internal struggle of someone wrestling with assumptions that had felt like certainties until facts proved otherwise. His jaw worked as he processed words that clearly didn't come easily, that required him to acknowledge error in front of subordinates who would remember this moment for years. "Corporal Cade," he said, and his voice carried across the silent room. "I owe you an apology." The words landed like artillery, unexpected and devastating in their impact. "I made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice and fear," Wolf continued, and the honesty in his voice suggested this cost him something to admit. "I dismissed your capabilities without giving you a fair chance to demonstrate them. I excluded you from planning, from team integration, from opportunities you had clearly earned. That was wrong." Ashlyn met his gaze steadily. She had imagined this moment in various forms over the past weeks, had rehearsed responses in her mind during long runs and late-night equipment maintenance. But now that it was here, she found the anger she expected to feel was absent, replaced by something closer to understanding. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," she said simply. Wolf seemed to need to say more, the words building pressure behind his carefully maintained expression. "I've been running sniper operations for 8 years. I thought I knew what excellence looked like, what the standard was. I let that standard become a limitation instead of a baseline." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of confession. 5 years ago, I lost my spotter, a rookie who made a bad call on wind. I trusted him and took the shot, and my teammate paid for that trust with a bullet to the chest. He survived, barely, but I swore I would never again put faith in someone unproven. What you did yesterday challenged everything I thought I knew about what was possible in those conditions. You didn't just meet standards, you exceeded them so completely that the standards themselves seem inadequate now. Brennan, we just didn't want to see it because it was easier to dismiss you than to acknowledge we were wrong. Ashlyn looked around the room at faces that had shown her nothing but skepticism and dismissal for weeks. Wolf with his trauma-based resistance, Donnelly and Hartley with their casual cruelty. Even Brennan, who had been kind, had still watched from the sidelines instead of actively defending her. "I appreciate the apologies," she said, and her voice carried quiet strength that came from somewhere deeper than validation. "But I didn't do this to prove you wrong. I did it because this team needed someone who could make those shots, and I knew I could make them. That's all." "That's not all, though," Wolf said, and something in his expression suggested he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "You could have made me look like a fool yesterday, could have complained to Commander Vance about being excluded, about the way the team treated you. You didn't. You just showed up and performed. That says something about your character that matters more than marksmanship scores." Ashlyn thought about her father, about the lessons he had taught her that went beyond shooting. "Honor isn't about being right, sweetheart," he had said during a competition where judges made obviously biased calls. "It's about doing right, even when no one's watching, even when you would be justified in doing less. My father taught me that excellence is its own reward," Ashlyn said. "That respect earned through performance is worth more than respect demanded through complaint. I trusted that if I did my job well enough, the rest would follow." Brennan nodded, recognition in his eyes. William understood that. The door to the common area opened, and Gunnery Sergeant Keller stepped inside, her timing suggesting she had been waiting for the right moment. Her expression carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that would change circumstances. "Corporal Cade," she said, "Commander Vance wants to see you. Bring your gear." Ashlyn stood and followed Keller out, leaving the team to their debrief. As they walked across the compound, now dry and bright under California sun, Keller spoke quietly. "What happened in there?" she asked. "Wolf apologized," Ashlyn replied. "The team, too." Keller nodded slowly. "Good. About time. How do you feel about it?" Ashlyn considered the question, examining her own emotional state with the same precision she applied to wind calculations. "Relieved," she said finally. "Not vindicated, just relieved that I can focus on the work now instead of constantly proving I belong." "That's mature," Keller observed. "Most people would want to savor the victory more, make them feel it longer." "I've been underestimated before," Ashlyn said. "This wasn't my first time proving people wrong. It probably won't be my last. The vindication gets old after a while." They reached Commander Vance's office where light burned despite the early hour. Keller knocked and entered, Ashlyn following. Vance stood near the window, looking out at the range where targets still stood from yesterday's exercise. Physical evidence of exceptional performance. "Corporal Cade," he said, turning as they entered. "Sit down." Ashlyn took the offered chair, her posture straight despite the long day before and the emotional weight of the morning's debrief. Vance remained standing, his expression thoughtful in ways that suggested decisions already made. "I received a call from Captain Hale this morning," he said without preamble. "She's recommending you for immediate advancement to instructor qualification. She also mentioned that Pacific Fleet is forming a specialized maritime unit. High-level operations, strategic targets, the kind of work that doesn't make the news or get discussed outside classified briefings." Ashlyn felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice steady. "Sir." Vance pulled out a file and opened it, though something in his manner suggested he had already memorized the contents. "I've been reading your full record, not just the highlights I reviewed during your intake. Your father was Master Sergeant William Cade, Army Rangers, killed in action during Operation Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan, 2014. "Yes, sir," Ashlyn said quietly. "The file mentions that you enlisted on your 18th birthday," Vance continued, 3 days after your father's memorial service. "That you requested sniper training specifically to follow in his footsteps." Ashlyn nodded, not trusting her voice. Vance closed the file and looked at her directly. "I want to ask you something, Corporal, and I want an honest answer. Are you doing this to honor your father's memory, or are you doing this because it's who you are?" The question cut deeper than Vance probably intended. Ashlyn had asked herself the same thing countless times over the years, during hard training days and lonely deployments, during moments when the weight of expectation felt too heavy to carry. She had thought initially she was doing it for her father, to complete the legacy he had started teaching her. But somewhere along the way, it had become something else, had transformed from tribute into calling, from memory into identity. "Both, sir," she said finally. "It started as honoring him, but somewhere in the process, the rifle, the calculations, the patience required, all of that became part of who I am. I don't know where his influence ends and my own nature begins anymore. Maybe they're the same thing." Vance nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. "The specialized unit I mentioned, they want to interview you next week. It's voluntary and there's no pressure from me, but I think you should consider it. Your skills are beyond what standard operations require." Ashlyn absorbed this information. A week ago, she had been excluded from training exercises, dismissed by her team, isolated and underestimated. Now she was being recommended for elite assignments, recognized by division leadership, offered opportunities that most operators spent careers working toward. "I'd like to think about it, sir," she said. "I just got here. The team is just starting to come together." Vance smiled slightly. "The fact that you're concerned about team cohesion tells me you're the right person for it. But take your time. The opportunity will be there when you're ready." Before Ashlyn could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door. Vance called for entry, and the door opened to reveal a man in civilian clothes, late 50s, weathered in ways that suggested hard years in hard places. His eyes carried the particular alertness of someone who had spent decades assuming danger in every shadow. "Commander Vance," the man said, his voice carrying authority despite the lack of uniform. "I'm looking for Corporal Ashlyn Cade." Vance's expression tightened fractionally. "And you are?" The man pulled credentials from his jacket. "Captain Thomas Reeves, retired. I served with Master Sergeant William Cade, multiple deployments including his final tour in Afghanistan." Ashlyn stood without conscious decision, her body responding to her father's name, spoken by someone who had known him. "You served with my father?" Reeves turned his full attention to her, and something in his expression softened. "I did. I was his team leader for the operation where he was killed. I've been trying to find you for 2 years." The room seemed to contract, air becoming thick and hard to breathe. Ashlyn had received the official notification of her father's death when she was 15, had attended the funeral with full military honors, had accepted the flag from solemn officers who spoke about sacrifice in service. But she had never spoken to anyone who was actually there, who had witnessed his final moments. "Why?" she managed to ask. Reeves glanced at Vance, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Commander, would it be possible to speak with Corporal Cade privately?" Vance considered, then nodded. "Use the conference room. Take your time." The conference room was small and sparse. A table and chairs and nothing else, designed for function rather than comfort. Reeves waited until Ashlyn sat before taking his own seat across from her. He pulled a worn folder from his jacket, the kind of personal file that had clearly traveled with him for years. "Your father was the best shooter I ever worked with," Reeves began without preamble. "Patient, precise, absolutely reliable under pressure. On his last operation, we were tasked with securing a compound in the Kunar province. Intelligence said it was a Taliban logistics hub." He paused, choosing words carefully. The intelligence was wrong. The compound was a meeting site for local elders trying to negotiate peace. We realized the error as we approached, called off the assault. But one of our elements had already engaged, thinking they were under fire. Chaos erupted. Ashlyn listened without moving, barely breathing, afraid that any interruption would stop the flow of information she had waited 11 years to hear. "Your father was on overwatch," Reeves continued. "He had eyes on the whole situation. He made a shot, 1,450 meters in high wind, that took out a Taliban fighter who had infiltrated the meeting and was about to detonate a suicide vest. Saved 32 people, including the elders and our assault team." Pride swelled in Ashlyn's chest, fierce and painful. But Reeves wasn't finished. The shot gave away his position. Taliban fighters swarmed the ridge. "Your father held them off long enough for us to extract the civilians and pull back. He died covering our withdrawal." Reeves opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. It showed a younger version of himself standing beside Ashlyn's father, both in desert fatigues, both smiling despite obvious exhaustion. Behind them, a ridge rose against a blue sky. "This was taken the day before he died," Reeves said. "He talked about you that whole deployment, showed everyone pictures, told stories about teaching you to shoot. He was so proud that you were following in his footsteps." Ashlyn felt tears tracking down her face, but made no move to wipe them away. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I made him a promise," Reeves said simply. "The night before that operation, we were talking about families, about what we'd do when we got home. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would find you and tell you 3 things. He pulled out a worn piece of paper, clearly carried and read many times over the years. "First, he said, that you were ready, that he had trained you as well as any shooter could be trained, and you should trust that preparation. Second, that he was proud of you, not for following him, but for being excellent in your own right. And third," Reeves said, his voice dropping slightly, "that the record he set, 1,450 meters in 1994, was actually 1,500 meters. The official documents were wrong, rounded down because division thought the actual distance was unverifiable. Ashlyn's breath caught. 1,500. Reeves nodded. I was there when he made it. I did the ranging myself. 1,500 meters exactly. He never corrected the official record because he didn't care about recognition. But he wanted you to know the truth. He said someday you might break it, and he wanted you to know what you were really chasing. The weight of that revelation settled over Ashlyn like a physical thing. The record she had heard about her entire life, the standard she had been measuring herself against, was actually 50 meters farther than anyone knew. Her father had been even more exceptional than the legends suggested. "Why did it take you years to find me?" Ashlyn asked. Reeves looked down at his hands. "I left the service after that deployment. PTSD, survivor's guilt, the usual demons. Spent years getting my head straight before I could face keeping my promise. Then I had to track you down. The military doesn't make it easy to find people who don't want to be found." "I wasn't hiding," Ashlyn said. "No," Reeves agreed, "but you were moving. Different assignments, different bases. I finally found you through the competition circuit, saw your name winning championships. I've been following your career since then, waiting for the right time. Why now?" "Because Captain Hale contacted me last week," Reeves said. "She told me William Cade's daughter had just broken the base record with a shot at 1,500 meters. She said you deserved to know the truth about what you were matching." Ashlyn sat back in her chair, processing layers of revelation. Her father's final shot had been the same distance as hers. The record she had just set wasn't breaking his achievement, but matching it 11 years later, carrying forward a capability that had died with him on an Afghan ridge. "There's one more thing," Reeves said, pulling out a final document from his folder. "This is a letter your father wrote the night before he died. He asked me to hold it and give it to you if you ever became a military sniper." He slid the envelope across the table. It was worn from years of carrying, her name written in her father's precise handwriting. "I'll leave you alone to read it," Reeves said, standing. "When you're done, I'll be outside. Take your time." After he left, Ashlyn sat staring at the envelope for a long moment. Her father's final words, written hours before the operation that would kill him. She opened it with trembling fingers and unfolded pages that had been waiting 11 years to deliver their message. "My dearest Ashlyn, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've become the shooter I always knew you would be. I'm writing this the night before an operation that intelligence says will be routine, but my instincts say otherwise. Just in case, I wanted to leave you with some final thoughts. First, I'm prouder of you than any words can express, not because you're following my path, but because you're walking it with grace and excellence that surpass anything I achieved. By the time you were 12, you were making shots I couldn't make until I was 25. You have a gift, sweetheart, not just talent, but true understanding of what it means to be a precision shooter. Second, I need you to know something about that base record everyone talks about. The official number is 1,450 meters, but the actual shot was 1,500. I never corrected it because numbers don't matter as much as capability. But you should know the truth, because someday you'll surpass it, and I want you to know exactly what you're surpassing. Third, and most important, stop chasing my shadow. I trained you to cast your own. The world doesn't need another William Cade. It needs the first Ashlyn Cade. Whatever you accomplish, do it for yourself, not for my memory. Live your own life, make your own choices, build your own legacy. I love you more than shooting, more than the military, more than anything in this world. If I don't make it back from this deployment, please know that every moment I spent training you was the greatest joy of my life. You are my finest achievement, not any shot I ever made. Be excellent, be patient, be certain, and when the moment comes, make the shot that matters. All my love, Dad. Ashlyn read the letter 3 times, tears falling freely now, grief and pride and love mixing into something too complex for simple naming. Her father had known, had seen his own death approaching with the same clarity he brought to reading wind, and had used his final hours to write her permission to be herself instead of his echo. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, holding it against her chest like a talisman. Outside the conference room, voices murmured as the base went about its daily business. People training and working and living the military life her father had loved. When she finally emerged, Reeves was waiting in the hallway, patient as stone. She walked up to him and without a word, embraced him. He stiffened for a moment, then returned the embrace. This stranger who had carried her father's final message across 11 years and thousands of miles. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping your promise." "He was worth it," Reeves said simply. "And so are you." Commander Vance appeared at the end of the hallway, his expression suggesting he had been briefed on what was happening. "Corporal Cade," he said gently, "take the rest of the day. We'll talk about the specialized unit tomorrow." Ashlyn nodded, not trusting her voice. She walked back to her quarters in a daze, the letter burning against her chest where she had tucked it safely in her jacket. Inside her room, she placed it carefully in her father's footlocker alongside his journal and medals. 3 generations of Cade family service nestled together. Then she lay on her bunk and let herself cry properly for the first time since the funeral 11 years ago. Cried for the father she had lost, for the weight she had been carrying, for the permission she had just received to be someone other than his reflection. Cried until the tears ran dry and left behind something cleaner, simpler. Peace. Evening found the team in the common area for what had become an impromptu celebration. Word had spread about the high readiness rating, about Captain Hale's recommendation, about the specialized unit offer. Someone had acquired beer from somewhere, and the mood was loose, relaxed in ways it hadn't been since Ashlyn arrived. Brennan found her sitting alone in the mess hall, picking at food she wasn't really eating. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She gestured to the empty seat across from her. Brennan sat with his own tray, studying her face with the careful attention of someone trained to read people. "You okay?" he asked. "You look like you've been crying." Ashlyn considered deflecting, then decided he deserved honesty. "Met someone who served with my father. He brought me a letter Dad wrote before he died." Brennan's expression softened. "That's heavy." "Yeah," Ashlyn agreed. "But good, necessary." They ate in companionable silence for a moment before Brennan spoke again. "The team's asking for you. They want you at the celebration." "I'm not sure I'm ready for that," Ashlyn admitted. Brennan nodded, understanding. "Your call, but for what it's worth, they're different now. Yesterday changed something, Wolf especially. He's been telling everyone who'll listen about that 1150 shot, about how you read wind patterns he couldn't see." Ashlyn smiled slightly. "Think he's ready to actually work with me instead of against me?" "I think he's ready to learn from you," Brennan said, "which is different and maybe more important." They finished their meals and walked together to the common area. The celebration paused when Ashlyn entered, everyone turning to look at her with expressions that ranged from welcoming to curious. Wolf stood and crossed the room carrying 2 beers. "Corporal Cade," he said, offering her one. "We were hoping you'd join us." Ashlyn took the beer, the gesture feeling symbolic of something larger than simple beverage sharing. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." Wolf cleared his throat, and the room quieted. "I want to propose a toast," he said, raising his beer, "to Corporal Ashlyn Cade, who showed us what's possible when we stop limiting ourselves with assumptions. To the highest qualification scores this unit has ever recorded, and to the future, whatever that holds." To Ashlyn, the room chorused, and she felt the weight of acceptance settling over her shoulders like a cloak. The evening progressed with the easy camaraderie of people who had shared something difficult and come out the other side stronger. Stories were told, mostly by the older members, tales of operations and close calls, and the strange humor that developed in people who live close to danger. Ashlyn found herself laughing, actually relaxing, the tension she had carried for weeks finally releasing. Later, as the celebration wound down and people drifted off to rack, Wolf approached her one more time. "I've been thinking," he said, About your father's record. The official one says 1,450 meters, but I looked into it. The actual shot was 1,500, same as yours yesterday. Ashlyn nodded. I just found that out today. Wolf studied her face. So you didn't break his record. You matched it. Ashlyn smiled, thinking of her father's letter, of his insistence that she cast her own shadow. I matched what's on paper, but tomorrow I'm going to surpass it, because that's what he trained me to do. 2 days passed in a strange limbo. The team treated Ashlyn differently now, not with the forced distance of before, but with genuine camaraderie that felt almost surreal after weeks of isolation. Donnelly invited her to join their morning runs. Hartley asked her advice on adjusting his scope. Even Wolf sought her input on training protocols. It felt like belonging, finally, which made the next emergency briefing all the more unexpected. The next morning brought another emergency briefing, this one even more urgent than the last. Commander Vance stood at the front of the room with Captain Hale beside him, both wearing expressions that suggested the stakes had just increased dramatically. Listen up, Vance said without preamble. We have a new challenge from Division. They want to validate yesterday's performance wasn't a fluke. They've designed something they're calling Apex Protocol. He pulled up imagery showing the range complex configured differently than before. Worst-case scenario conditions. Wind speeds up to 25 knots with irregular gusting, reduced visibility, and a single target at 1,500 meters. The room went absolutely silent. 1,500 meters in those conditions was beyond what most military snipers ever attempted in field operations. It was the realm of specialized competition shooting and theoretical exercises. This isn't mandatory, Vance continued, but Division wants to see if yesterday's results are repeatable. Corporal Cade, this is your call. No pressure from command either way. Ashlyn stood, her heart beating steady despite the magnitude of what was being asked. When, sir? Tomorrow morning, 0600, Vance said. Same position you used yesterday. Division observers will be present with full technical analysis equipment. Ashlyn thought about her father's letter, about his final instruction to make the shot that matters. She thought about the 1,500-meter shot he had made in Afghanistan while under fire, the shot that saved 32 lives and gave away his position. She thought about matching his capability and then surpassing it. I'll do it, she said. The room erupted in murmurs, excitement and concern mixing. Wolf stood and the noise died. Corporal Cade, he said, and his voice carried respect that hadn't been there a week ago. I'd like to work with you on preparation. Run scenarios, verify equipment, make sure every variable is accounted for. Ashlyn nodded. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. I'd appreciate that. They spent the rest of the day in obsessive preparation that bordered on ritual. Brennan reviewed every technical specification of Ashlyn's rifle, checking tolerances down to thousandths of an inch. Wolf helped gather meteorological data, studying historical wind patterns for the specific terrain. Donnelly and Hartley offered to run support, to be present even though the shot would be Ashlyn's alone. As evening approached, Captain Hale arrived with technical observers and additional equipment. She pulled Ashlyn aside for a private conversation, her expression serious. I need you to understand something, Hale said. This isn't just about you anymore. Division is using this to justify future investments in precision marksmanship programs. If you succeed, it opens doors for capabilities development across multiple branches. If you fail, it sets the program back years. Ashlyn absorbed the weight of that responsibility. No pressure, ma'am. Hale smiled slightly. You can refuse. No one would think less of you. Yesterday's performance already exceeded every expectation. Ashlyn thought about her father holding a ridge against overwhelming force so others could escape. Thought about the weight of responsibility he had carried without complaint. Thought about the legacy he had left her, not of fear but of capability. I'm not refusing, ma'am, Ashlyn said. This is what I was trained for. Hale studied her for a long moment. Your father would be proud, Not just of your shooting, but of your courage. That evening, Ashlyn sat alone on the ridge where tomorrow's shot would happen. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the base had grown quiet below. Brennan climbed up to join her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might be up here," he said, offering her a cup. They sat in silence, watching the light fade, both understanding that some moments required quiet more than conversation. Finally, Brennan spoke. "Your father and I sat here the night before he set the record, right in this spot. He was nervous, which was rare for him. I asked him what he was thinking about." "What did he say?" Ashlyn asked. Brennan smiled at the memory. "He said he was thinking about his daughter, about how someday she'd be sitting where he was sitting, about to make an impossible shot. He said he hoped he'd done enough to prepare you." Ashlyn felt tears threatening again, but held them back. "Did he know that I'd actually do this?" Brennan nodded. He knew. And he said something else. He said, "When that day came, when you were facing your impossible shot, I should tell you that he trusted you completely, that you were ready, that you'd always been ready." They finished their coffee as full darkness fell, stars emerging one by one until the sky was full of light. Tomorrow would bring the shot that would define her career, that would prove whether her father's faith had been justified. But tonight, she had permission to simply be still, to exist in the quiet space between preparation and execution. "I'm ready," she whispered to the darkness, to her father's memory, to herself. And in the morning, she would prove it. The dawn broke cold and clear, the kind of California morning that felt like a gift from a generous universe. Ashlyn had been awake since 3, unable to sleep, running through calculations and scenarios in her mind. She ran her miles, cleaned her rifle one final time, and arrived at the ridge 30 minutes early. The operations center below was already alive with activity. Division observers set up their equipment, technical analysis stations that would measure every aspect of the shot. Commander Vance stood with Captain Hale, both of them watching the ridge where Ashlyn would soon take position. Brennan arrived with his spotting equipment, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Wolf came too, offering support even though his role would be minimal. The team gathered below, wanting to witness this moment, even from a distance. Ashlyn set up in the exact position her father had used 31 years ago. She could feel his presence here, could imagine him lying where she now lay, making calculations with the same precision she had inherited. The target at 1,500 meters was barely visible even through her scope, a dark shape against darker terrain. Wind conditions were already difficult, gusting between 18 and 23 knots, direction shifting with the kind of irregularity that made prediction nearly impossible. Brennan's instruments showed chaos, variables that changed faster than he could measure them. "This is harder than yesterday," Brennan said quietly. "Winds all over the place. You've got maybe a 15-second window when it settles, and those windows are coming 20 minutes apart." Ashlyn nodded, feeling the wind on her face, reading it the way her father had taught her. She closed her eyes and let her body become the instrument, trusting senses that had been trained since childhood. The radio crackled. "All stations, this is Commande. Apex protocol is hot. Corporal Cade, you have 3 attempts. Engage when ready." Ashlyn opened her eyes and settled into her rifle. The mathematics ran through her mind automatically. 1,500 meters, 2.1 seconds of flight time, 14 feet of wind drift if she calculated for average conditions, elevation difference, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, all the variables that turn shooting from simple mechanics into complex art. She waited, patient as stone, watching the grass bend and recover, watching dust swirl and settle. The first attempt window opened, and she considered taking it, but something felt wrong, some instinct that whispered, "Not yet." The window closed. 20 minutes passed. The second window approached, and this time she felt it. Felt the moment when chaos organized itself into brief predictability. She fired. 2.1 seconds of absolute silence as the round traveled downrange. Every eye in the operations center fixed on monitors showing the target. Brennan tracked through his scope, following the bullet's arc. "Miss," he called, his voice tight. 4 inches left. Ashlyn absorbed the information without emotion. The wind had shifted in the final half-second, a gust she hadn't predicted. She had 1 attempt remaining. 20 minutes passed like 20 hours. The team below watched in silence. Division observers made notes. Commander Vance and Captain Hale stood without moving, witnesses to something that would be remembered or forgotten based on what happened in the next few minutes. The third window approached. Ashlyn felt the wind patterns shifting, felt the complex rhythms that defied simple measurement. She thought about her father's letter, about his instruction to be excellent, to be patient, to be certain. She thought about the shot he had made in Afghanistan, 1,500 meters under fire, the shot that saved 32 lives and cost him his own. She thought about legacy and capability and the difference between chasing shadows and casting light. The wind settled into its pattern, 3 seconds hard, 2 seconds calm, the cycle repeating with mechanical precision that wouldn't last. Ashlyn waited for the calm, trusted her preparation completely, and fired. The round left her rifle, and she knew with absolute certainty born of 10,000 hours of practice and 20 years of dedication. Knew the way her father had known when he made his final shot. 2.1 seconds of flight. "Hit," Brennan called, his voice rising with emotion he couldn't suppress. "Center mass, direct hit." The operations center erupted. Division observers confirmed the impact, their instruments validating what eyes had seen. Captain Hale smiled broadly, something rare enough to be noteworthy. Commander Vance keyed his radio. "Apex protocol complete. Corporal Cade, new base record. 1,500 meters, extreme conditions. Outstanding shooting." Ashlyn broke position and sat up, hands trembling slightly now that it was over. Brennan was staring at her with something approaching awe. "That was impossible," he said. "The conditions alone should have made that shot less than 5% probability." "My father made it in worse," Ashlyn replied quietly. "Under fire, with people's lives depending on it. This was just target practice in comparison." Below, the team was celebrating, their voices carrying up the ridge. Wolf's voice came through the radio, professional discipline barely containing genuine emotion. "Corporal Cade, return to Operations Center. Captain Hale wants to debrief." The walk down took longer than the climb up had. Ashlyn's legs suddenly weak as adrenaline faded. When she reached the Operations Center, the entire team was waiting. They parted as she approached, creating a path to where Captain Hale stood with official documentation. Gunnery Sergeant Keller, who had watched Ashlyn's journey from skeptical observer to quiet advocate, was the first to shake her hand. "I knew you were different from day one, Corporal. Glad I was right." "Corporal Ashlyn Cade," Hale said formally, "on behalf of Pacific Fleet Command, I'm authorizing the correction of 2 base records. Master Sergeant William Cade's 1994 shot is officially recorded at 1,500 meters. And your shot today establishes a new record at the same distance, achieved under conditions our technical team rates as significantly more difficult." She extended her hand, and Ashlyn shook it, feeling the weight of history and expectation finally lifting. "There's one more thing," Hale said, pulling out another folder. "The specialized maritime unit offer still stands, but I have a different proposal. We're creating a new advanced scout sniper program, training the next generation for impossible shots. I want you to build it, not as a student, as lead instructor." Ashlyn looked at Wolf, at Brennan, at Donnelly and Hartley, and the team that had finally become hers. She thought about her father's letter, about casting her own shadow instead of living in his. "I'll take the instructor position," she said, "but on one condition. This team comes with me. They help me become who I am. They should help train the next generation." Wolf looked surprised. You want us? My father taught me that excellence is built on teamwork, Ashlyn said. I can't do this alone. Hale smiled. Done. You'll all transfer together. Welcome to the Advanced Scout Sniper School. 1 year later, Staff Sergeant Ashlyn Cade stood before a class of 20 new students, mixed gender and multiple branches, all gathered to learn the techniques that had redefined what was considered possible in precision marksmanship. Behind her hung a memorial wall with 2 photographs. Master Sergeant William Cade in dress uniform, his Medal of Honor citation describing actions that saved 32 lives, and beside it a new addition, the official record board showing both Cade's at 1,500 meters, father and daughter separated by 30 years, but united in capability. My name is Staff Sergeant Ashlyn Cade, she said to the assembled students. The man on this wall was my father. He held the base record for 31 years. Last year I matched it. This school exists to teach you to surpass us both. A young student, female and nervous, raised her hand. Ma'am, what's the secret? How do we learn to make impossible shots? Ashlyn smiled, thinking of her father's voice, of Brennan's patience, of Wolf's hard-won respect. There's no secret, just preparation, patience, and the certainty that when the moment comes, you'll be ready. My father taught me that. Now I'm teaching you. She led them to the range where Brennan waited at the spotting scopes and Wolf supervised equipment. Gunnery Sergeant Keller had transferred with them, running administrative operations with the same sharp efficiency she brought to everything. The morning stretched ahead, full of possibility and potential, the beginning of something that would extend her father's legacy far beyond what any single shot could accomplish. And as she watched her students settle into shooting positions, learning to read wind and calculate drift, Ashlyn understood finally what her father had meant. This was casting her own shadow. This was making the shot that mattered most. 3 months into the first class, Commander Vance arrived for an inspection. He found Ashlyn on the range with her students, all of them prone, all of them reading wind with the technique William had pioneered and Ashlyn had refined. Vance watched in silence as a young corporal made a 1,200-meter shot that would have been impossible under the old training doctrine. Then another student, then a third. Staff Sergeant Cade, Vance said, Pacific Fleet Command has reviewed your curriculum. They're implementing the Cade method as mandatory training for all scout snipers across Naval Special Operations. He handed her official documentation, stamped and sealed. Effective immediately, every SEAL sniper will train using your father's techniques. And yours. Ashlyn looked at the document, then at her students, then at the memorial wall where 2 Cades now stood immortalized, not just in photographs, but in doctrine. He would have liked that, she said quietly. He earned it, Vance replied. So did you. Not the impossible 1,500-meter kill, though that would be remembered in record books and division evaluations. But the knowledge shared, the skills passed forward, the endless multiplication of excellence that would outlive them all. Every graduate who left her school carried a piece of William Cade forward into the world, carried a piece of Ashlyn forward, carried the understanding that excellence wasn't about individual glory, but about elevating everyone who came after. That was the shot that mattered most. That was the legacy that would never fade.